This is not AI. This is not CGI. This is a deep-sea fish from the genus Chaunacops, commonly known as the Darwin fish, for obvious reasons. Chaunacops is just one of many types of fish alive today, with swimming fins that moonlight as hands and feet. Other groups of fish have evolved this trait independently, and they've done it in very different ways. I love walking fish because if a picture is worth 1,000 words, well, even just a short montage of walking fish, whether they walk on the seafloor or shuffle around on land, even a handful of clips serve as an entire lesson on how evolution works. You understand it instantly. You don't need me to say a thing. But, of course, I will say a thing. Today's lesson is on the foundations of evolutionary biology. The second video in my series for Destin on the evolution of bacterial flagella. Aside from these images of amazing walking fish, there are two things, Destin, that I hope you remember forever from today's lesson. First, evolution is competent without comprehension. Other teachers and writers have said this through various analogies. Evolution is a blind watchmaker. Evolution is an engineering process without an engineer. Or evolution is a self-driving design process, one which, once started, does not need a designer to ever intervene. Today, you won't just hear that evolution is competent without comprehension. You will see that evolution is competent without comprehension. I have brought the receipts. Some of them, and we're going to see a bunch more receipts next week and the week after. The second thing that I hope you remember from this video, Destin, is that there is always more than one way to web a duck. There's always more than one way to web a duck, if by duck you mean any bird that swims. The guy on the end there is actually a penguin. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to call this video. I might call it Darwin's Strange Inversion of Reasoning, and we'll see why here in a moment. Maybe I'll call it Evolution, Competence Without Comprehension. Or maybe I'll just go for some YouTube-y thing like The Truth About Evolution, What Your Teacher Didn't Tell You. I don't know, maybe that's a little bit too clickbaity. How about this? You are watching How the Bacterial Flagella Evolved, Episode 2, The Fundamentals of Evolution. The stuff you need to know before diving into the evolution of bacterial flagella. This is a ball of clay that represents all the bacteria in your body. That's over 30 trillion individuals. Have you ever heard someone say that your body is mostly made of bacteria? Most of your cells are not even your cells. Newer calculations have come out and said that's not the case. By cell count, the number of bacterial cells in your body compared to the number of human cells in your body, it's roughly 1-to-1. Roughly 1-to-1. But okay, 1-to-1, that's still a lot, right? Here's the thing. Your cells, your eukaryotic human cells, are monstrous compared to a bacterial cell. If you are 5'9" and you weigh about 155 pounds, how much of that weight is bacteria? The answer is 200 grams. Give or take. On camera, it's kind of hard to tell exactly how much that is. It's about the size of a cup of coffee, a small cup of coffee that you might get at Starbucks or whatever. Bacteria are amazing organisms. They're small, but they also reproduce really fast. E. coli, which is one of the species that lives in your intestines, E. coli can double every 20 minutes. 20 minutes, that's all it takes for their population to double in mass. That doubling only happens, of course, when there's lots of food, the perfect temperature, the perfect everything. But here's a question for you. How long would it take this ball, supposing we had infinite food, how long would it take for this ball to grow to be the same mass as the entire planet Earth? We could either do a back-of-the-envelope calculation, which I don't really know how to do. I had to cheat using the internet. Or we could just plot it on a graph and also plot the mass of the Earth on that same graph and see where the two lines intersect. We're starting with the bacteria from one human being. That's 200 grams. It doubles every 20 minutes. If this ball were bacteria fed perfectly, it would grow to be the size of the entire Earth in just 28 hours. 28 hours and 20-something minutes. So why then is the entire planet not just made of gray little goo? The answer is the struggle for existence. A bacterial population can only double in size when conditions are absolutely perfect. Things are never like this in the wild, at least not for very long. As the population grows, individuals start competing with each other for resources. Those who are stuck in the middle can't get any food. Life is chaos. Darwin realized that populations grow exponentially, but resources are limited. Let my arm be the limit of resources. As a population reaches that limit, sometimes it'll go over that limit and then it crashes, and then it will level out. This limit is what we call carrying capacity. Most populations that you find in nature are at carrying capacity. Carrying capacity will fluctuate over the year as seasons change, as food availability changes, and so on. But most organisms are at carrying capacity at any given time. What that means is that for one to come in, one has to go out. This is what Charles Darwin called the struggle for existence. And it's why natural selection is so powerful. This here is a very simplified outline of the process of evolution by natural selection. When I say it's simplified, I mean it's very, very simplified. This is just review. We're going to blast through this, Destin. If you have any questions about any of these things, I could talk for hours about each item on the list here. My assumption, though, is that this is old news to you. But even if it does feel too basic, stick with it. It's a really important warm-up. Thinking about evolution is weird. It's a strange inversion of reasoning. When parents have children, those children are often slightly different from their parents and slightly different from each other. Some of those differences, not all of them, but some of those differences between offspring and between parents and offspring are the result of mutations. If that child grows up and then reproduces itself, it can pass that mutation on to its offspring. So you have reproduction plus heritable variation. Natural selection is just the simple fact that some of those variations, those chance mutations, will happen to make it harder for the offspring that suffered that mutation to survive and reproduce than it was for the parents to survive and reproduce within that specific environment. Other chance mutations happen to make it easier to survive and reproduce within that specific environment. The beneficial mutations accumulate, they stack up one after the other, after the other, after the other, while the negative mutations are deleted. They're deleted either immediately, the child doesn't survive to adulthood, or the child might survive to adulthood, might reproduce, but it doesn't have as many offspring as its siblings. And so over several generations, that negative mutation will be deleted. It'll be drowned out by the success of these siblings. This is it. This is the basics of adaptive evolution. Evolution by natural selection. Before evolution can get started, you need something capable of reproduction with heritable variation. You need some sort of a system capable of robust replication plus occasional mutation. But once you have that, however that thing first got started, this process is competent without comprehension. As the generations pass on, individuals get better and better at surviving and reproducing within their specific environments. Their bodies are sculpted to survive in that specific environment, and there does not need to be any understanding at all. The organism doesn't need to understand what traits it should have to survive and reproduce better. The environment itself doesn't need to know anything either. Because it's hard to survive and reproduce on this planet, and because different environments and ecosystems have different challenges, different mutations end up being selected for in different circumstances. Adaptation happens. Competence without comprehension. This is the meat and potatoes of evolution by natural selection. You have chance mutations that are generating what is largely random variation. And then you have natural selection. You have the struggle for existence, which constantly deletes any bad variations and lets rare beneficial mutations accumulate time and time and time again. They just stack up. This, Darwin proposed, not only explains the diversity of life on Earth, it also explains why organisms are so specifically adapted to the exact environments in which they live. Just look at this bird that I filmed in Ecuador. Its ridiculous long-toed feet are specifically adapted to live on the silly floating plants that grow along the shores of swampy ponds. Who would have thought you could make a living doing that? Evolution by natural selection. After Darwin and Wallace published their paper on the theory of evolution, and then Darwin published his book, several people tried to pick it apart. And of course they did. One of the most important jobs of a scientist is to critique new ideas. Oftentimes they do this harshly. Most of this happened through debates and short articles, but pretty quickly, scientists started critiquing Darwin in book form. One of the early scientific books trying to offer an alternative to evolution was this one by Sir Richard Owen. It's actually a 3-part series. The arguments Owen presented didn't really shake out. The scientific community eventually realized that Darwin was right, but many people in the public were offended by evolution. They didn't care about a careful, honest, critical analysis of the data. People just wanted someone clever and persuasive to make Darwin bleed. Well, figuratively make him bleed. Nobody actually wanted to hurt Darwin. The first full-fledged anti-evolution, anti-Darwin book ever written is probably this one right here. The Darwinian Theory of the Transmutation of Species, examined by a graduate of the University of Cambridge, Robert Mackenzie Beverley. In here, he puts forth the argument against evolution from irreducible complexity. It's very similar to the one that you put forth, Destin. He did not use the term irreducible complexity. That term didn't exist yet. And he didn't talk about bacterial flagella. Instead, he used the lungs and the circulatory system for his example of what some people now call irreducible complexity. In the book, he claims that to accept evolution requires a, quote, strange inversion of reasoning. Instead, he thinks that we should just trust what he calls common sense. And these are my words, they're not his words, but basically he's saying that we should just blindly trust our gut instinct without examining it. Now, Destin, as an engineer, you know that common sense can oftentimes be very helpful, even in engineering, even in science, but also it can mislead you. You actually did a video about this a while ago when Neil deGrasse Tyson was misled by common sense into thinking that a helicopter, if its engine fails, will fall like a brick. Turns out Neil was wrong about that. I'm sure you have countless examples of this in your own work as an engineer. Sometimes you have to suck it up and go through this strange inversion of reasoning. When I was a kid, probably younger than 10, we had a friend of the family who really hated evolution. She told us that we should never learn it, we should never think about it, we should never undergo this strange inversion of reasoning. She told us that it would be dangerous. When you tell that to a little kid, 2 things might happen. One is they might get scared and never want to learn about that subject ever. The other is that they might become really curious. In my case, both things happened at once. I wanted to see for myself what would happen if I put in the hard work to actually test out this strange inversion. In my case, this took a long time. It took over a decade. We didn't have the internet back then, not in my house. We did have some encyclopedias that talked about evolution, but I thought my parents believed what their anti-evolution friend believed. It turns out they didn't, but I thought they did, and so I was actually shy to read the encyclopedia, the section on evolution. I remember one time I actually did muster the courage, but my mom walked in on me, and I slammed it shut like it was a dirty magazine. It's kind of sad to think back on that. My parents' friend had really done a number on my brain there, but that was okay. It forced me to go outside and just look at nature, study nature myself. And eventually, my own observations combined with things that I had read, things that I had seen in nature documentaries, it clicked. Here is a picture that I drew shortly after to try to explain the moment that I gained the ability to quickly switch back and forth between understanding how humans go about intelligently designing their machines, and then flipping to think about the very different way in which nature generates its machines through the process of evolution by natural selection. You could say that it was a backwards bike moment. At this point, I think the concept that evolution could be competent without comprehension is still a little bit fuzzy. So let's explore this idea with a quick thought experiment. After that, we'll move on to the observable evidence demonstrating that evolution has all the tools needed to produce these so-called irreducibly complex systems. Things like the circulatory system or the bacterial flagellum. Things with multiple well-matched parts, all of which it seems at first glance must have come into existence together from the start. That's actually not the case, but it seems like that at first glance. Okay, the thought experiment. These are the feet of a chicken. I want you to notice there's a little bit of webbing in between those toes. Just a little bit. These are the feet of a duck. There's a lot of bit of webbing between those toes. Through the process we just looked at, evolution by natural selection, it's not hard to imagine that if you had a bunch of chickens that were in some sort of an environment where they had to swim in order to find the best food, well, over multiple generations, and biologists might argue about how many generations it would actually take, but over multiple generations, you could get the evolution of webbed duck-like feet from the almost webless feet of a chicken. Some people don't know this, but chickens already can swim a little bit. They're surprisingly good swimmers, actually. This is Roxy the swimming chicken. I'm just showing you a short little clip here. I do recommend that everyone go to the Jazo Sack YouTube channel. Not sure I'm saying that right. Where you can watch the full thing. Go over there, like and subscribe and all that stuff. But if you released a bunch of chickens on some sort of an island where all the best food was in the middle of a lake, well, there's going to be selection pressure, is what we call it, for swimming. Any chicken that happens to be better than others, or better than average at swimming, will get more food and will reproduce more often than those that are worse at swimming on this hypothetical island. If you look at any population of chickens right now, there is variation in the amount of webbing between their toes. This chicken here has almost none, whereas this blue-legged chicken, she has a lot of webbing between her toes, quite a bit. I'd put that at 12%. Most people, and Destin, I'm going to assume that you're one of these people, most people have no problem with this idea that if you put some chickens on an island, the best food was in the water, they're going to evolve something like webbed feet if you allow enough time. People are going to argue about how long it might take. Maybe it'd take a couple thousand generations, maybe hundreds of thousands of generations, but there is a number where even the most hardcore skeptic will say, yeah. If you look around in the wild, you see that there's lots of animals that are kind of in between. This is a sandpiper. They spend a lot of time walking around in wet sand, and they spend a fair amount of time swimming. If you have too much webbing, your feet will get heavy with wet sand. If you don't have enough, then you're not going to be able to swim very strong. So they've evolved this little compromise. The magpie goose is another compromised example of webbed feet. Most penguin species are up around 80%, I would say. And then you have the mallard duck, which clocks in my view, at about 90%. I say 90, not 100, because look at the back toe. The back toe is missing webbing, whereas in the blue-footed booby, we find 100% webbing. Evolution could make webbed feet, but there might be some people watching this that are still not buying it. Some people might say, oh, well, there's this waiting game that happens in evolution. You have to wait for the right mutation before natural selection can select it. And that's true. There really is a waiting game in evolution. However, it turns out that there is more than one way to web a duck. Check this out. This is a grebe. Cute little duck-looking thing. It's not a true duck, but look at its feet. It evolved webbing on its feet in a completely different way. Instead of the webbing starting in between the toes and being pushed out to the tip, these scales on the sides of the toes extended outward. A similar thing happened in coots. Look at this guy. That's what a coot's feet look like. Those are really cool. So, there's more than one way to web a duck. The important thing to notice, again, is that this process is competent without comprehension. I'm not saying this because I'm fundamentally against the concept of intelligent design, no intelligence allowed. I'm just pointing out the fact that neither the duck nor the duck's cells needed to intelligently know or comprehend anything about fluid dynamics before it could evolve these wonderful webbed feet. It's not that intelligence is not allowed, it's that intelligence is not needed. It's easy to see that this is true when we're looking at something as simple as webbing between toes. But the process of evolution really does have limitations. Here's a short list of the most important ones. Number 5, Destin, is the one that you seem to be most concerned about. At first glance, the incremental nature of evolution seems to suggest that it cannot produce complex structures like bacterial flagella. This is where careful science comes in. This is where we have to stop trusting our gut and follow the evidence. Science is the collection and documentation of observations and an ongoing debate about what those observations most likely mean. Despite its limitations, the process of evolution is far more powerful than most people understand. We don't just think it's powerful, we know it's powerful because we've observed evolution happening in real time. Starting today and then continuing over the next few weeks, we're going to focus on 4 observed abilities of evolution. And when we look at each one of these, so duplication, for example, here I'm going to show you several examples of duplication inferred in the wild. So no human was there watching when that evolutionary event occurred. We infer that it happened through comparative anatomy. We infer that it happened because of evidence we have today. Then we'll look at examples seen under domestication. 4-horned sheep evolved from 2-horned sheep in captivity. There were no scientists there to watch it. Instead, it was sheep herders who were there. But there were people there when that happened. And then finally, for each of these 4 abilities, we're going to look at actual direct observations in the laboratory. evolution is directly observable. So let's dive in, starting with number 1, optimization. This is the simplest tool in evolution's toolkit. Right here, we are looking at a Galapagos tortoise eating fresh grass, one of their favorite foods. Notice that beautiful dome-shaped shell. This is very common for these tortoises on islands with lots of ground vegetation, lots of grasses. But not all of the Galapagos Islands have ground vegetation. Some of the drier islands are covered in cactuses, which is also great food for a tortoise. But the plants grow tall, meaning there is competition among turtles for the cactus pads that can be reached most easily. It appears that this competition has driven the evolution of saddle-shaped shells. This one here is an extreme case, but the tortoises on many of the cactus islands have varying degrees of saddle-shaped shells, a shape that allows the tortoise to stretch its neck extra high. These tortoises have been optimized by evolution for reach. There's actually a researcher in Alabama, Dr. Ilanya Chiati, who studies how these saddle shells affect the tortoise's ability to right itself if it's ever flipped over. She suspects that this trait might also serve a role there, but results aren't as clear as the obvious advantage when foraging for food. Here we are looking at what used to be called freshwater dolphins, the Tucuxi river dolphins in the genus Satalia. We thought that these guys lived all throughout the Amazon River, but we actually now know there are 2 populations. One is a saltwater population. Actually, it's a brackish water population. It can tolerate freshwater for a little bit, but it needs a lot of salt, similar to its fully marine dolphin cousins. And then you've got a freshwater version that really can't handle salt at all. If we go down to Brazil, we can see the habitat of these species. Some of the saltwater dolphins, the Guianensis dolphins, they can be found all along the coast of Brazil, but most of them live right here. This is an estuary. It's where the river meets the sea, the Amazon River meets the sea. Estuaries are the perfect places for organisms to evolve from saltwater to freshwater because saltwater is heavier than freshwater. It sinks. What this means is that all the organisms living here, they can hang out in the saltwater and then swim up to the freshwater. Maybe they might find certain fish that they like to eat in the freshwater better than in the saltwater, even if they are themselves a saltwater species. Then they can dive back down into the saltwater. And so it's this perfect spot for evolution to start pulling and tweaking, modifying a population for a freshwater lifestyle. And that's what's happened here. One of the populations of these dolphins evolved through the optimization process of evolution to become fully freshwater. It can now no longer live in saltwater, actually. It can only visit there temporarily. And they have now inhabited the entire Amazon River, the rivers entering the Amazon, and you can find them all the way over in Ecuador. If you go to the Stated Clearly website, you'll find that I run a tour in Ecuador, the Evolution Tour. We actually stay at a lodge. It's right here. And these dolphins can be spotted on this tour. They live all the way up here by the Andes Mountains, all the way across the continent. It's amazing how far these animals have gotten from their roots. All right, Destin, now we are going to look at one of my favorite groups of animals, amphipods. I understand that these are not everyone's favorite, but for me they are very special. Quite a diverse group of organisms. Most live in the ocean, some live in freshwater. They're not shrimp, though they do kind of look like shrimp. The reason I love these organisms, Destin, is that, as I mentioned, when I was a very young child, I was shy to read about evolution, so I had to study it on my own. We had friends that lived out on the coast. We'd visit them a lot, and I loved playing with amphipods. In the tide pools, there were species that were fully aquatic. I mean, if you take them out of water, the first thing they try to do is they try to get back into the water. They'll crawl and find their way back. They like to be fully submerged in water at all times. Other species I noticed, and I noticed this as a very small child, they like to be out of water, but in wet sand and in drying up seaweed. They don't like dry sand. They like wet sand. We called these guys sand fleas because of the way they would jump. Look, he just jumped off my finger there. They have these springy little tails, which we'll revisit later on here. What I noticed about this species is that if you put it in the water, they start to get uncomfortable. It takes several minutes, but they start to get anxious. They start to swim around. They start to jump around underwater. And if you give them some sand, they immediately climb up to the waterline. They are not comfortable when fully submerged. Now, I now know that the reason for this is that their gills are optimized to be wet but not submerged. They work best when they're wet in the open air. They're getting lots of oxygen from the atmosphere. But they don't do well when fully dried out, and they don't do well when fully submerged. As a little kid curious about evolution and suspicious that evolution might be a thing, this was a huge piece of evidence for me. I later learned there is a third species, a species commonly known as lawn shrimp, that do not need to be wet in order to survive. Their gills work just fine, completely out of water, and in fact, if you get them wet, too wet, if you completely flood your lawn, they will drown. So, that's a pretty big slap in the face. A powerful bit of evidence for evolution's ability to optimize a species for life in a new habitat. So there we have a bunch of evidence for optimization in evolution in the wild, but of course no one was there to watch the evolution of these traits evolve. We have to infer that evolution by studying these species and comparing them one to another. But optimization has also been seen under domestication. This is the Norwegian Lundhund. It's a puffin hunting dog. Beautiful, beautiful dog. Unfortunately, this breed is almost extinct. They almost went extinct during World War II, and the ones that are left are really inbred. Their population went down to 6 individuals, and now they actually have a lot of different genetic problems. Breeders are trying to fix this by crossing them with outside breeds and so on, but they have some very unique adaptations for hunting puffins. Puffins live in burrows on the sides of cliffs, and sometimes they just dig burrows in the mud, in the dirt. These dogs are the right size to go into those burrows, and they are also extremely flexible. They can get inside of a burrow, a very tight burrow, and they can turn around with ease because of how flexible they are. And look at this. If you don't own dogs, you might not think this is special, this photograph right here. But if you do own dogs, you know that this is incredibly flexible for a dog. Normally, dogs cannot move their arms like that. But the Norwegian Lundhund, not only can it bend its head way back like this, it can put its arms completely out to the side because of how flexible it is. That's not the only adaptation these dogs have. We'll look at more of them later. But this is simple optimization observed under captivity. There are countless examples of optimization. Just think of all the fruits and vegetables and cattle, and everything that we have domesticated is a modified version of the wild thing, modified through optimization. Mutation plus selection, in this case selection by humans. And then we have observed optimization in the laboratory. This experiment is really interesting. This is an experiment by Harvard. They have a giant plate here for bacteria to grow in. Each section of the plate has a different amount of antibiotic in it. So the first plates on the outer sides, they don't have any. The concentration of antibiotics increases as you get towards the center. And watch what happens when they inoculate this plate with bacteria. So the bacteria grows. It grows just fine to that first antibiotic line. Then you get a mutation that occurs, and it allows some of the bacteria to break through that barrier. They can survive with the antibiotic. They struggle, and then they break the second layer. You're seeing multiple lineages evolve at the same time right here, which is really interesting. And when we study the genetics of this, we find that different lineages chance upon different mutations that end up doing the same thing, but differently. Each mutation happens to make the bacteria better at tolerating antibiotics, but different mutations do this through very different mechanisms. The so-called waiting problem in evolution, it's easily handled because, duh, remember, there is more than one way to web a duck. Finally, after 11 days of evolution, this whole thing is just 11 days of evolution, they break through that last barrier. They survive an agar containing 1,000 times more antibiotic than is needed to kill the starting population. This is extreme optimization through evolution directly observed in the laboratory. What a beautiful experiment by Harvard researchers. One of the really neat things that we just saw here is that evolutionary time does not just have length. Evolutionary time has volume. Evolutionary time here was very short, just several days long, but evolutionary time had width. That width is the population size in organisms that have the ability to swap genes either through sexual reproduction or through bacterial conjugation. That's how bacteria normally do it. The ability to swap genes is a third dimension to evolutionary time. I'm actually not sure, but I think in this experiment they disabled conjugation. They don't mention that specifically in the paper, but most experiments like this do use conjugation-disabled bacteria. It slows down evolution, but it makes the data easier to follow. But in this experiment, evolutionary time at least has area. Not only do we have time in length, but we have width as the population size. Billions of individuals are aimlessly searching mutation space in parallel. Evolutionary time has volume. When you see an experiment like this, there's a couple of questions that a good skeptic should be asking. First of all, how much of this adaptation is actually evolution? Chance mutation followed by natural selection. How much of this was real evolution versus phenotypic plasticity? So if I go lift weights, I will grow more muscle mass, and then I'll be able to lift more weights. How much of this antibiotic resistance, how much of that was just phenotypic plasticity? Well, it turns out that this was not phenotypic plasticity. This was real evolution, and we know this because these scientists sequenced the DNA of these different bacteria at different stages. They found that this was real evolution we are witnessing here. Mutation followed by multiple rounds of selection, letting positive mutations accumulate in a classic stepwise fashion, exactly how Darwin predicted. The other question a good skeptic should ask is, how many of these mutations that were beneficial in the moment were actually degenerative overall? How many of these mutations just broke stuff to get ahead? And the answer is not zero. There is a gene called PIT-A. It's a non-essential gene. It codes for a protein that helps bacteria gather nutrients, but it also makes them extra vulnerable to antibiotics. That gene just flat out broke in several different lineages. It broke in different ways in different lineages. Some of those breaks were so bad that the bacteria will probably never recover that gene again. That protein is now lost to all of its descendants forever. Not really forever, because bacteria do a thing called conjugation, so they can actually get that gene back from someone else. But it broke here in the experiment, and it's not going to be recovered through normal mutations. This was the case for several other genes as well. Mutations that broke those genes caused a temporary benefit to the bacteria when it was exposed to super high amounts of antibiotic. That said, the majority of the mutations in this experiment did not break things. They actually just modified things. They modified things in a way that the protein could still work, but it's not going to work in a way that makes it vulnerable to the antibiotic. When trade-offs were in play, when a mutation made a specific protein worse at its function but better at resisting antibiotics, in many cases these trade-offs were balanced out later through what are called compensatory mutations. You can literally see this happening in this experiment right here. In the middle right column, we see the bacteria get sort of clear. It's not growing very dense. This is because of a compromising mutation. It made one of its proteins worse at its original job but better at antibiotic resistance. And here, this dot, a chance mutation has just occurred that happened to compensate for the earlier mutation that weakened that gene's function. Now the gene functions good as new, but it is resistant to antibiotics, causing this lineage to spill over into the next level of antibiotic density. Let's watch that again, sped up even faster. That is a compensatory mutation happening right before your very eyes. Who cares about the Super Bowl? You are observing evolution be competent without comprehension, right before your very eyes. This is so fun to see, and it just happened over the course of 11 days. Okay, this has been a lot of information. This was a really fun intro to evolution course. Probably the funnest I've ever had making one. So far, we've still only covered optimization, evolution, optimization mutations, and so on. Even though this is very interesting and extremely impressive, this simple type of evolution is not enough to get you to the bacterial flagellum. But don't you worry, next week we're going to be back to learn about co-option, duplication, and finally, recruitment. For those who are brave enough to stick through the entire series, you will go away knowing, not because I told you, but because you've seen it for yourself, that the normal process of evolution has all the tools needed to produce these so-called irreducibly complex systems. So what have we learned, Destin? We have learned that evolution is competent without comprehension. We saw this with our own eyes. We have learned that there is more than one way to web a duck, and we learned that evolutionary time has volume. That one was an unexpected bonus. I knew I was going to cover this sometime during this series, but I didn't know I was going to do that today when I started recording. Huge thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. I am not joking. I cannot do this right now without support. My science outreach funding was cut by the powers that be. Don't get me wrong, I am very grateful that I had that while it lasted. Aside from supporting me on Patreon, you can also go to the Stated Clearly shop and get some stickers. There's a link down in the video description. Destin, my friend, I will see you next week.